I really feel like we need digital literacy now in that same way so that we can cope with this new world, because it's not just a device, it's not a tool, it's actually a world.
Hi, this is Shashank,
Hi, I'm Aishwarya.
and welcome to the CCG Tech Podcast.
Hi, Bishakha. Thanks so much for being with us here and agreeing to be on the CCG Tech Podcast. Why don't we start with a brief introduction from you about yourself and what you've been up to?
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm actually very excited about this conversation. So, my name is Bishakha Datta. I live in what I now call Alibom, which is between Alibag and Bombay or Mumbai. And I run a non-profit called Point of View, and we are trying to actually build digital spaces that are more gender just or gender equal. In terms of my background, actually, I used to be a journalist and a documentary filmmaker before I started working in the non-profit sector. And so, sort of, expression and gender and all those things are of particular interest to me, particularly like, when expression is stifled or not free, etc. I sort of am interested in all that stuff.
Thanks, Vishaka. So, just to set a broad context for the conversation today, we wanted to talk to you about broadly the impact of the gender divide on the internet. And so, when we're talking about gender, we're not just talking, a lot of conversation tends to be around women, but we do want to have more of an expansive definition of what we consider to be gender. So, and how it affects digital rights and participation and sort of the concept of online safe spaces and what this means for folks across the gender spectrum. So maybe we can start off really broadly and just, and I can ask you, how pervasive is the digital divide really at this point in India? I know we hear a lot about it in policy conversations and sort of like lawmaking conversations. A lot of that tends to be around, access to infrastructure and hardware and things like that. But if you were to talk about a gender-based digital divide, does it exist? I feel like the answer has to be yes. But also, what are the kinds of differences that we see in access to the internet devices, things like that? So from your experience, you could tell us a little bit about that.
Super, that's a great starting point, Aishwarya. So I think the first thing which is really interesting is that today, when people talk about the gender digital divide, we are talking not only about access, but also about use and experience, right? But to start with access, and I found a set of numbers which I think are very telling. So GSMA did a report in 2023. They produce an annual report which is called the Mobile Gender Gap Report. And I think it's wonderful that it focuses on mobile, because in countries like India, most people access the internet through mobiles, right? And that's going to be the future. And what they found again was that in India itself, the gap in mobile ownership between women and men is 11%. But if you look at smartphone ownership, it's 40%. And if you look at mobile internet use, it's 40%. 40% is a lot. And the other very interesting thing that they found is that till the pandemic, there was a big gap, gender gap, but it sort of, it equaled, the gap narrowed a little bit during the pandemic, but has again started slowing down, right? They haven't been able to explain why, but that's kind of interesting, because we kind of assume that, that it keeps, the gender gap will keep narrowing every year, but that's not the case in India for sure. So if we sort of now go beyond the numbers, what we are seeing is that, first of all, women are not a homogeneous category, right? And I think, again, what's very telling, if you look at the numbers, is no other gender is ever measured, right? Like there is absolutely no data on, say, trans persons. And, trans persons are a recognized category in India, right? So even if we say that, okay, we may not be at the stage yet in India where we can measure say 20 different genders, but it's very hard to understand why we are not measuring trans persons because they have been given a certain level of recognition by the state, right? So it's always a very binary kind of thing. Now, that said, if we sort of move beyond like, hey, okay, now you have a mobile phone in your hand, but now what's the difference? The difference that we are seeing again is that it's not so much having the mobile in your hand that determines how you can use it. It's everything that's below it, right? Like sort of a whole bunch of, like I always say that it's like an iceberg, and what we see is the top, which is the mobile phone. But actually below it, there are a whole bunch of like norms related to gender, right? And let me give you one norm. For example, this study by GSMA also found that women post much fewer photographs than men. And it's the same for girls and boys. So one of the norms, for women in countries like India, particularly young women, is that you should like that you shouldn't voice yourself too much, right? You shouldn't reveal too much of yourself, etc. And we see this in physical spaces, right? Where suppose somebody wants to wear a particular kind of clothing, a young woman, her family is like, no, you can't wear this, etc., etc. Log kya kahenge, blah, blah, blah. Now that same norm is moving online, where it's like, no, now you can't post a photo of yourself wearing this dress because what are people going to say, right? And we find actually that a lot of young women say that the people who really exercise heavy control in their families is brothers, who are constantly monitoring them. So at some of our workshops, we sort of say, okay, who in your family is like the biggest gatekeeper? And, young women are always like, oh, it's my brother. It's not necessarily my mother or my father, but my brother is kind of on social media and he's looking at everything I post, etc., and sort of having a running commentary in the background saying, okay, you shouldn't have posted this, you shouldn't have done this, I'm going to tell our parents, blah, blah, blah. I can go into lots more detail, but I can also wait for, a little while to talk more.
No, thanks, Bishaka. And it's very interesting what you mentioned about the tip of the iceberg being accessibility to the device. But what really matters is how are women and other genders being able to use that mobile phone, and what does that access look like? I think that's very insightful. And please continue talking, because what my next sort of question or prompt to you is, what are the factors that dictate these norms, right? As you were pointing to, family and male figures, authoritative male figures in family settings, whether it's the brother or the father, we've heard through studies. And so please continue talking about, are there other factors when it comes to caste or religion or even other socio-economic barriers? So I would just encourage you to keep on going, and thanks so much.
Super. Okay, so let me try and actually, one of the things I did want to do is say that, um, women and other marginalized genders are not a homogenous category, right? So let me start actually with one of the groups that we work with who are rarely talked about when it comes to sort of gender and mobiles, which is sex workers. And this is a very interesting category because in India, a lot of sex workers are Dalit. But the identity that they have is not sort of a caste-based identity, in a political sense, right? Now, what is interesting when you look at sex workers is, first of all, many of them have very low literacy levels, and many of them have developed the most interesting hacks to use mobile phones. So, for example, if you can't read a name, then, how do you save somebody's phone number? Because you still have to look up the person's name to access that phone number, right? So sex workers use visuals, like somebody will be given the visual of a rose, or somebody will be given like a lion or a whatever, right? But I think it's very interesting because when we look at sort of mobile phones or the internet, the way they are designed is it's imagined to be used by somebody. And clearly that somebody is assumed to be literate, right? Therefore, the sort of emphasis on text, etc. So what we are finding in use is that women who are not literate are basically developing hacks, whether you're a sex worker, whoever you are, or if you're a woman with a disability. But to sort of move on a little more, the norm when it comes to sex workers, what affects them is because they use it for both work and personal life. But because the work that they do is seen as like morally wrong, right, or stigmatized, they often have to separate their work and their personal identity. So, duplicate SIMs or dual phones or ensuring your work conversations are not seen by your kids or your parents, etc., sort of governs their use, right? So, there are very interesting sort of different sort of ways in which people use phones. Similarly, with women with disabilities, what happens, I think, is that, not all sites are accessible. And here, the very interesting point that we've come across in our work is that, just like anybody else, women with disabilities also want privacy. But often, there are certain things they can't do, and therefore their caregiver has to do it. And so that privacy goes. Let me give you a concrete example. Suppose you get an OTP on your phone, then there's a time limit in which you have to punch in that OTP, right? Which works for many of us. But if you are somebody, say, who has cerebral palsy, then you can't move your fingers so quickly, so that you exceed that time limit. So your option then is either you have to give that OTP to your caregiver, which means you then become like a less independent person, right? Or you have to basically keep waiting till you get an OTP that sort of comes into the time limit or whatever your fingers are. So there's a lot of actually what we call intersectionality, which means that how you use the internet is not dependent only on your gender, but it's that combination of how your gender intersects with either your disability or your occupation or your sexual orientation, right? So, for instance, we find in the case of one very interesting thing in India is that with LGBTQI groups, from 2010, when the Android phone first came to India, till today, around the country, every single LGBTQI plus group that has formed or collective has first formed online because it's safer, right? Because you could be in a small town, you could be in a village, you could be in a bigger town, whatever, but you then all of them. I mean, it's incredible. So it also sort of shows you, in a sense, how important the internet is for expression, right? Including sexual expression. And what, again, the use that we are seeing, which is very interesting, is that, for, say, finding community, if you're queer or trans and you're in India, you may not find that community in physical spaces. So you're looking for that community online. And we found during the pandemic, actually, that there were quite a few cases of queer and trans people saying that because they were in lockdown and at home all the time, they were using their phones for everything, right? But you can also, when you're at home all the time, 24/7, you might leave your phone just lying around. And so they inadvertently got outed to their families, right? Somebody saw an image, something, so it sort of created a really bad situation. So I'm just trying to give you a sense, actually, because we work with all these groups, of how when we come to the use level, right? Because the norm is that the prevalent norm in society is that heterosexuality is the way to go. So it's not a digital rule, but it's like a societal rule. And you may not have revealed to your family that you're queer or you're trans or whatever, but then suddenly your family gets to know through the phone, and then your phone gets taken away, and your phone is anyway your lifeline and sort of your connection to your community. So there's a lot of these norms really lurking below, right, which are pretty much pushing everybody to non-optimal use, I would say.
No, this is really interesting though, because so one of the main things I think that at least comes up in conversations around privacy, for example, and digital use is that these are the kinds of things exactly that right privacy and like a private space is supposed to help provide for people. So essentially, even if you do have physical, mental, sort of like sexual preferences that you don't want folks to know, then the fact that you can sort of like find communities, find spaces to sort of explore this safely online. But from what you're saying, it also seems like though, even for folks who have access to digital devices, even if there are spaces and communities that they can participate in online, it sounds like this isn't necessarily the same kind of like mainstream spaces that a lot of the rest of the world, or like I guess the more heteronormative world sort of uses. And so I guess the question that comes to me from that is how does this, I mean, it is great and obviously it is a good thing that there are communities you can build and rely on online. But also what is the cost of, I guess, not being able to participate in the more typical spaces as like a trans person, for example, or as someone, although you do see more of that happening, but I do think that's a lot more like socio-politically of a certain class than, you know, folks who without like access to devices that are unsupervised, for example. So I was just curious about what you thought about that.
What I think is very interesting is that human beings have a natural tendency to subvert the cages that you build around. And let me illustrate this with an example of a lot of trans and queer people around the world, but most certainly in India. So we know that many groups who are stigmatized use social media through a dual account system. And I'm not even going to call these fake accounts, we call them alternative accounts, because one is the public facing account, where you have your family, grandmother, uncle, everybody who wants to, your school friends, everybody who sees your public identity. And you may not have come out in that identity, right? Because it may not be safe for you to do so. So, in a sense, what you're doing is you're building a safe space for yourself online through that public identity. At the same time, you have a second account, which is a private account, and you give access to people to whom you want to come out and whom you're comfortable with it. So you're building kind of a layered safe space for yourself, right? In, say, on social media. This is very common in Instagram and in Facebook. That's at the individual level. Other very interesting thing is a lot of the collectives and groups around India that we spoke to, right? Like right from, say, Shillong and Assam to Dehradun to sort of Trichur, etc. They all said that when we start our groups online, we start with what are called secret groups. So again, it's a way of, so, what I'm trying to say is that people find a way, even if through that sort of, through the infrastructure that exists, to be able to use it to the best of their ability, right? So that it suits their needs. And I'll give you another very interesting example.
And Bishakha, sorry, can you explain what are these secret groups? How do they manifest? How are they created? I think for our listeners, it'll be very insightful.
Sure. So I think one is that, secret groups means that you can't, it's not like it's open, it's a closed group, first of all. So it's not like it's open for everybody to enter. Second, usually invitation is through reference. So somebody has to refer somebody else, right, to be invited, so that if there's a problem, then the inviter can be held accountable or at least be told, like, "Arey, now what is this," etc., right? So that's the second thing. I think the third thing is that I'm not sure about the technical aspects of secret groups, to be honest, but I think it also may not necessarily show up on your profile, etc., right, or be linked to your profile. And the other thing is, I think the norms that exist in secret groups are like, confidentiality, that nothing goes out of the group, etc., etc., right? But it's very interesting if you think of it from an infrastructure perspective, because when we imagine, say, a Facebook, even when we think of an Instagram, right, we think of the public feed Instagram, right? Like the infinite scroll of unending. we rarely think that there's actually also these little spaces. I mean, Instagram, it's a little more obvious because many people have private accounts on Instagram, right? For a range of reasons. But again, it's kind of interesting if you think of these spaces like architecturally, it's almost like a building front where you can see some windows, but some windows are less visible, right? But they exist. It's just that you don't kind of know they exist, right? And if you ask me honestly, I think this gives a real degree of freedom to everybody. I give you another two examples I want to actually give you all. One is a very funny one, which is my niece put up an image of herself with some guy on Instagram, and they were sort of, had their hands around each other, etc. So some sort of relational kind of thing. And I was like, oh my God, now should I be liking this? Should I not be liking? Because I'm the aunt, right? I'm technically family. And the other thing that we find also is, again, in this sort of romance, desire, sexuality stream, is if we go to the phone. Now, we did these workshops in the Sundarbans, and, before we were doing them, a bunch of parents came to us and said, oh, we're so happy you're doing these workshops because, all our teenage girls are running away with boys, and it's the mobile phone that is making them run away. Okay. So I was like, first of all, our objective of our workshop is not to get people to stop using mobile phones or to stop eloping or whatever, right? But what if you sort of deconstruct what these parents are saying? In a sense, they're saying that if you're in a very physically small, kind of easily surveilled area, like a village, where everybody has listening posts and ears and all through neighbors, then the phone almost becomes like your gateway. It literally gives you mobility to develop relationships, maybe find, maybe a develop a relationship where somebody is from another religion, another caste, which were totally frowned upon in physical space, right? These are some of the sort of interesting ways in which, I think trans, queer, with sex workers, it's very interesting because sex workers, even in physical space, before the mobile phone came, right, have always had a dual identity privacy management system in life. And they've brought that to the fore.
No, that's so interesting, Bishaka. And I'm just going to take a minute to point to some of the wonderful things you're saying. One is, thanks for making me fall back in love with the internet. That's not all the conversations we have on this podcast. And what I'm picking up from what you're saying is that online and offline spaces are often
Absolutely.
interlinked.
Yeah.
But the online space sometimes gives a sense of, I can say, privacy or zones of protection that are not very easy in offline space, especially for marginalized
Absolutely.
genders, right?
Can I just add one
And
thing to that?
of
It's
course,
like Dr.
please.
Ambedkar said, there's a quote from him. Now, I don't remember the exact quote, but he said that he talked about the anonymity of the big city. When
Yeah,
people come from
yeah,
villages to the big city, they like
yeah,
the freedom that anonymity gives you, right? Because there are
yeah,
millions, like, Mumbai, where I lived, like 20 million people. So you're just like, if we think of our sort of digital life like that, in a sense,
yeah,
it's like you
yeah,
might be living in a small village, right, where there's very strict and everything is like measured by like caste and class and
yeah,
religion and like every social norm under the sun. But here, at
yeah,
least seemingly, a
yeah.
bunch of your early experiences give you that sense of being in the big city.
No, that's great. And believe me, Ashwarya and I are furiously typing anonymity on our shared document. But I'll come to that. I also wanted to point to something you were saying, Bishaka, is the role of creating
Yeah,
safe communities on the internet, right? And actually, one of the biggest goals of having this conversation was what do we need to do to create safe spaces on the internet for women and other genders, right? And I'll come to my sort of prompt for the next stream of conversation is we have this policy conversation in India that everyone should be verified, link your Aadhaar to social media, anonymity is meaningless, everyone, big tech knows you anyway. And clearly from what you are saying is that anonymity is almost gold
Yeah.
for these communities, whether it's secret groups that you were pointing to, or really operationalizing your self-expression behind a digital sort of identity. So I want to let you explore the anonymity stream a bit, and how important that is, especially for women and other genders.
Okay, so here's the funny thing. Anonymity is a double-edged sword, as we know. There is no doubt that stigmatized communities with need at least anonymity in relation to other human beings online. The machine is another story, because the machine is recording your every swipe and your everything, and the machine is able to link your, say, if you have two accounts, right, the machine is able to link those, and then it'll, even to your private account, keep suggesting that you become friends with everybody who's on your public account, blah blah blah, right? So in a sense, anonymity exists up to a certain level and is also a little bit of an illusion, because it's not complete. But frankly, I'm always fighting with sort of hardcore digital rights folks, saying, okay, so what if it's not complete? Why should it be zero? Right? If I am, say, queer, and I can have 60% anonymity online, and that helps me function, and it's not perfect, why should I give up that 60%, right, which I don't have in other spaces? So I think that's one part of it. The other part of anonymity is, a lot of the work we do is also on trying to deal with what's called technology facilitated gender based violence, which is a mouthful. Yeah, TFGBV. But the thing is, it's basically like digital, harassment, abuse, violence, etc. Now, there's an assumption. A lot of people or a lot of women will say, oh, anonymity is not good for us, because that's what allows people to be harmful online, or like, But frankly, a lot of the studies have also shown that it's not necessarily anonymity, it's what's called the disinhibition effect, right? There's something that happens to our headspace when we go into digital spaces. Somehow that screen in front of us screens us from sort of behaving as if we're with real people, right? And it unleashes some part of our personality that we would never unleash, like in other public spaces, right? You would never walk down a road, right? If we think of both, like, say, many social media spaces as public as well as the street as public, you would never just walk down a road and start randomly abusing people, although that is happening more and more, because the increasingly violence is spreading from here to there, right? I mean, also online norms are going off. But and there was a very interesting experiment actually done by an artist called Marina Abramovich in a big gallery. I can't remember where, like, where she did she was the exhibit, and she was nude, and she sat on a chair or something of the sort for 7 days, a very famous exhibition. And she basically there was a little note saying that, okay, I am the exhibit, do whatever you want. I mean, it may not have said do whatever you want, because this will sound wrong when I say the next thing. But she said, I'm the exhibit. So some people came and sat down and chatted with her, etc., etc. I mean, she didn't speak, but it basically degenerated dramatically over time to where she was almost like sexually assaulted, almost, like somebody put a knife at her throat, that kind of thing, because there were no, so that somehow that something changed in people's heads. And they started seeing her as like less than human in a sense, because she was an exhibit. So more than anonymity, there's something going on which is like more in our psyches online, right? And the best explanation I've seen is what they call the disinhibition effect, that it somehow makes you feel disinhibited.
It's really interesting you bring this up because I've also followed her work a little bit, and I do know the one that you're talking about.
Yeah,
And I remember her talking
right.
about how it was both. I mean, people were either really sweet or really, I don't know, scary in like some ways. And so how it was, yeah. But I mean, she I think explores a lot of this like discomfort in a lot of her work because I think she does a lot more like endurance art and stuff as well. I think she was like live streamed for 12 days after 9/11, stuff like that. So she's done a lot of really interesting work, and I think it's really um as a person who is like uh, not anywhere close to being of the same personality type who's like willing to do this kind of thing, I think it's really interesting to see what happens when people put themselves out there in that fashion. But I also think what you're saying about the depersonalization, I think, is where a lot of like what we try to solve through regulation, through laws, and all of that comes in. And I also think this is why you have the biggest like push against anonymity, right? Where everyone's like, oh, you can say whatever online, harass people online, etc. Like you're saying, it's very much a double-edged sword. Actually, before we get to that, I just had one question on like something you said earlier. When we were originally talking about the digital divide and how you were talking about brothers being, for example, the folks who are, policing a lot of like houses and stuff. I'm just wondering what does this look like? So does it mean like access to devices are because for me, I would think if you are able to also create an anonymous account or whatever, if the phone is not yours and if someone is just like looking at what you're doing on the phone, that doesn't really make too much of a difference. So is that what you're talking about, as in like access to devices being policed at that level, or is it more of a what are you doing on it and can you still hide things, stuff like that?
So we are seeing, for instance, it's both. It really
Mm-hmm.
depends on your income level. So suppose you come from a much poorer family where the device
Right.
is
Yeah.
shared, then it's a real problem, etc. Yeah. So there the and then access to the device is sort of reduced, etc. That kind of thing. Um, if you I mean, even if you have access to the same device and you have a social media account, right? Um, it's just this unending sort of, there's an assumption that the men in the family have to regulate what the women, girls, etc. are doing, right? So it actually plays out at both levels. And I think what also happens is if somebody experiences, like, I'll give you an example, suppose somebody who has a feature phone, not a smartphone, right? Like the old type of what they call button mobiles in some places. Um, Suppose she gets a blank call or a series of blank calls. Then she knows somebody is trying to harass her, right? And she wants to do something about it and she assumes she's a teenage girl. Problem is, if she goes to her brother or her parents, they are going to say, okay, now you don't need to use the phone only. And, so basically will have to give up her sort of digital rights, right, in a sense.
Yeah, so I mean, basically, the fact is that, like you're saying, phones, devices, the internet are sort of gateways to autonomy and independence. And essentially, if you're trying to control any of that, that doesn't really like go in the same way.
Thank you for summing it up so beautifully, actually. Now I will use your line somewhere. Yeah.
We also do hear a lot more in general, which I think is good about the fact of a digital divide, how it plays out socio-politically in different ways, how it disadvantages people without access to devices, things like that. But like Shashank was maybe saying, it's worth sometimes thinking about what the promise of the internet could originally be. Because I remember when, it came up, and this is also when I was in college, I was growing up, and I was really enamored by like the
Yeah.
early like utopian feminist. I mean, even then I knew it was like unrealistic, but it was really nice to, think about what people thought would be possible with the internet, where we would have like equality in all realms forever. We'd create a parallel world online where there'd be no, none of the same socio-political kind of issues as we do in real life, things like that. I know that hasn't quite played out, but I was wondering if you could talk about some of the interesting, good, but essentially, like, how is the internet and digital devices, to the extent that it is, a tool for like sort of positive influence, positive like sort of community building and action? Like, what are the ways in which folks from marginalized communities are using the internet that we could learn from as a whole? And even if you don't have to learn from it, like, just what are the ways in which it's actually been like a source for good instead of just something that is also, a source for like policing and surveillance and
Okay, I
things like
think
that?
I have spoken about it, and I also don't want to, beyond the point, sort of say that the internet is like fabulous and there's nothing wrong with it. But the thing is,
Fair
yes, I
enough.
think if you look at individual use of people from marginalized communities, it's really almost like going back to the promise of the early internet, right? Because they are experiencing those same joys, liberation. The word is liberation, really. Exploration, expression, freedom. That's really what's being experienced. I mean, of course, at the practical day to day level, yes, you can get more employment, you can get more information, you can get health information, you can, do a range of more sort of functional things with the internet. But that is not where people's dreams lie, right? What people want is like entertainment, friendship. They also like when they see something on TikTok or Instagram or whatever, they want to be part of that. I mean, this is a very human urge, right? These are actually the big things that make our lives worth living. So that is what I think is the real lure of the internet and the real promise. What is sad, if you ask me, is that much of it is that you can have great experiences, but some of it still remains an illusion, right? And some of it still remains very hard to deal with. So, what we find with marginalized communities, and particularly women and other gender minorities, if you're from a low income community, particularly, your access to digital literacy is very low, right? And I want to say here that, when we went to school, we learned, like as kids, we learned the three R's, right? Like reading, writing, arithmetic, which were considered foundational to literacy. And that's what takes us ahead in life. And we now live in a world that is physical and digital or phygital. I really feel like we need digital literacy now in that same way so that we can cope with this new world, because it's not just a device, it's not a tool, it's actually a world. What happens when you don't have an opportunity to go to digital school is you can't understand many of the risks, many of the dangers or threats or harms, and one, if they befall you, you don't know what to do about it. That is the real problem, right? So if you're, say, the kind of communities I've been describing are very vulnerable to financial fraud, whether it's loan apps, employment apps, right, which ask you for access to your contacts before giving you the loan app, etc. I mean, before giving you the loan, etc. Right, or ask you to pay a small amount, right? So what is happening on the other hand is that you're getting excited by the promise, but you don't know enough to know that, oh my God, if I give you access to my contacts, what could go wrong? But then suddenly your loan is up and you've been, and suddenly you're being told, hey, if you don't pay right now, I am going to like reveal your intimate images to your contact list, because the app has already got permission to your gallery as well, to your so you see, now if you look at it from the perspective of that individual, she can't connect those three dots. She can't connect the loan app with the problem with giving contact permission and the problem with giving permission to your images, right? So that's digital literacy, according to me. So that's the problem, that people are getting really sort of like, it's like the dream souring and turning into a nightmare.
Thanks for putting it that way, Bishaka. And so much of what you're saying is highlighting the reality to me that when we talk about privacy, when we talk about autonomy as digital rights, students and policy researchers, we need to really broaden the conversation. We need to include more groups. We need to make it more
Absolutely.
inclusive. We need to consider intersectionality, because you're really changing the way I think about anonymity, right? The way you said even 60% autonomy is very good for a queer person. And I'm just going to mention a couple of streams of thought that the conversation is prompting, and I'll pass the baton to you to close the conversation. I wanted to ask you, or tell us if possible, what are the popular apps or what are the popular spaces that gender minorities or marginalized genders use, because a lot of focus is given on social media or the public layer of the internet, especially when it comes to even regulation. So are they using end-to-end encrypted website, apps like WhatsApp or Signal or Telegram, or they're using social media, the chat layer of social media, for example? The reason to ask this question is so that our listeners understand what are essential spaces that marginalized communities make use of.
I think from what we are seeing, the three biggest is one, WhatsApp. I think the second is definitely, like social media, varying between Instagram and Facebook largely.
Yeah,
Third is YouTube,
yeah,
actually. Yeah,
interesting.
because again, think about like literacy and visuals and all that, right? So we
Yeah,
find in both rural, semi urban, urban communities that where literacy levels are slightly lower, everybody
yeah.
is using YouTube. So if you ask them, they'll be like WhatsApp and YouTube, right?
Interesting. Yeah. And I think sometimes in policy conversations, we miss the elephant in the room, that is YouTube, because it doesn't require you to be, the literacy levels are not very high to engage with it. But I think it's pervasive because even I, as a privileged individual and digitally literate, really use YouTube.
Can I add one thing? This
Yeah,
is a
please,
terrible
please, of
and very
course.
sad thing that I came across on the internet, where somebody had
Yeah,
created a caste system of the internet, right? I don't know if you've come across this, where certain apps were sort of, you know, considered to be Dalit, like some were seen as Brahmins, some were seen as Kshatriyas, right? And so an app like Instagram actually was placed as, so the interesting thing is everybody we meet, and so much of our work is with low income, everybody wants to be on Instagram. That's the big aspiration, right? Yeah, and it was
aspirational.
very
Yeah,
sad to see that, first of all, that somebody would make a caste hierarchy based on the internet. And, of course, top of that was Instagram, seen as sort of the elite, the sort of whatever, the highest, yeah. So just wanted to put that in there. And people use Indian apps as well. Like, for instance, after TikTok was
yeah,
banned, there's a Indian app called Tiki,
yeah.
right? I have a Samsung phone, so every time I update it,
Yeah.
I get like a whole bunch of like coo and this and that.
No, and you're right. I remember when the TikTok ban happened, so much of the conversation was the demographic of the people who were using TikTok, right? And they are not the same people who are using Instagram. So the elite
Yeah,
marking that you're talking about is very real on the internet. And how like app bans or website bans impact the demography of the internet as well. I think sometimes we
yeah,
don't
and
talk
the
about that
design,
enough.
Shashank. Because what
Yeah,
happens is, see, if you're somebody who's not like very highly literate and you go into an app which is mainly text based, which is
yeah,
largely in English. See, because when we go to an Instagram or something, it's not like the first screen is telling you, hello, namaste, salam, which language would you like to choose? If you had an app where on your phone, the first screen you got was like both voice and text. And it said something in two, three languages, right? Because it only knows you're from
yeah,
India because yeah, IP is
yeah,
there. And it just said, oh, then you would feel like this. Suppose you're a Tamil speaker, you would feel like,
yeah,
okay, this app is for me also. But because the
yeah,
initial everything is in English till the localization sort of
yeah.
switches, right? Still
Yeah.
feel like these apps are not exactly made for me.
Yeah, and that makes me think about Twitter, right? So much of attention is spent on Twitter, which is primarily a English-based text space, and there's so many other spaces where conversations and communities are being done. But Vishaka, to close it out, I want to pass the baton to you to talk to us about what should we
Yeah,
do, or even if I'm just a young person listening to this, I care about the gender divide, I care about inclusive communities both online and offline. How should we think about, or what path should we choose to narrow this gap to address the intersectionality? And I know it's a very big question, there can't be one solution, but through your work, through your engagement on the ground, what are some of the
Okay.
key solutions that we need to think about? Yeah.
Okay, let me start with two like policy related things, which I think are very doable if you ask me. When we go to school, there have always been scholarships for people from low income communities. I really think we need digital scholarships, right? For like girls or for trans people, etc., in low income communities, which basically could take any form. It could take the form of having like a space from where you can either borrow a mobile or something. It can take any form, but we need digital scholarships. Second thing is really, I really think we need a curriculum which from the time we are learning ABCD we are learning like something about phones, because the truth is that it's a younger and younger demographic that is turning to phones. So at least by like the fourth or fifth standard for now, but later I would say like you really need to build it in with alphabets. The That's sort of a policy sort of ask. I think the second thing I would say is that like for platforms, I always feel like design. Can you design your platform so that if I am facing harassment, I don't have to like go through 100 screens to find where I have to complain, right? I mean, in some places it's easier, but again, keep in mind that, I may be somebody who just has access to my phone like a few hours a day. I don't know that space so well. So for me to then navigate it, it becomes difficult, right? Like that kind of thing. So can't we have sort of something right on the landing screen which says, hey, feeling uncomfortable, feeling unsafe, click or whatever. I think the other thing I would say is that if we think of sort of like policy, we think of platform, let's now come to us, right? Users. I think one is really support and allyship in digital spaces. I'll give you an example. In Point of View, we use an app called Slack, right? And we have a channel called Leave. Now, every time somebody feels like they're unwell or whatever, they put up a little message saying, hey, whatever, I've got a migraine or like period pain or whatever. And all other people write in saying like, oh, I hope you feel better, yay, wo, etc. And everybody is like, oh, we feel so supported just by through these comments, etc. Right? So support and allyship counts for a lot. I think even privately reaching out to someone who's experiencing harassment and saying, hey, are you doing okay? Do you want some help? Right? Everybody may not, but sort of saying, look, something nice, right? Yeah. So sort of dealing with that like toxicity, which seems to sort of somehow always be around as well online. And I would say finally, if we go offline, it's us. We are the same people who are online, right? So it's really like trying to, if you have somebody in your family, like a sister, etc., cousin, whatever, and she's sort of getting, monitored by the family, maybe to try and speak up, to try and explain, to again just to support her, right? But not to control her. I think that is the really important thing. And I think from the perspective of gender identity and sexual orientation, I think there's just so much, not just transphobia, but there's so much online where it seems as if the world is still only two genders. So can we, that it's a very unwelcoming atmosphere because it makes you feel like you're the exception, not part of the. So how can we make people feel like they belong, right? So again, support, ally, reach out to people, etc. We don't live in a world where if you're trans and you're going through something, only another trans person will help you. That's not okay. We are all in this world together online, right? Yeah.
Thanks so much, Bishakha. I just wanted to ask, as a sort of last thing, I know that we've covered a lot, but I just want to give you the space to talk about something if you think we've missed out on asking you about anything you wanted to speak about, if there's anything else you want to cover in the context of the conversation that we've had. So just generally,
No,
if
I
there's
think
anything.
it's actually, I've thoroughly enjoyed it actually. And I had detailed notes, etc., but I've departed from it long back. But the thing that I was going to say is that do you think it comes across as too euphoric about the internet? No, I think we've gone into enough, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I do think so as
Yeah,
well.
not at all, Vishaka. I think,
Just
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
But I did want to ask you about where
Yes.
people can find you on social media,
Sure.
if that's something you want to share.
Yeah.
Some of the work that Point of View is doing, stuff like that, that you'd want our
So
listeners to kind of
I
know
am
about.
on both X, where my handle is at busy dot, and Point of View has an account, and it's at POV Mumbai.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you so much, Bishaka, for being, part of this conversation. It was fun for me, and we've not done a gender conversation before, so it was enlightening. Thank you
Thank
so
you so
much.
much for having me. It was really fun for me too, and it actually made me think a lot about why we do the work that we do.
We would love to hear your thoughts on the episode and your suggestions on what topics you would like us to cover. You can reach out to us through email or find us on our social media. We will link the details of these in the show notes. Lastly, we would like to thank National Law University Delhi for their support in creating the podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening to the podcast. We look forward to bringing you more content. This podcast is created by Center for Communication Governance at National Law University Delhi. This episode was edited by Gopika.